So these are my main editions of Book One, The Tower Treasure, and I have four, which are actually pretty straightforward. But this is where you start to get into minutia of editions. So the only original text I have is, of course, the Applewood 1991 reprinting of the original text with the original 1929 cover. Um, these are now, of course, long out of print, and at least the first couple volumes aren't super expensive, but they are really wonderful recreations of the originals. And of course, the Tower Treasure being the first and really the most difficult to obtain in mint shape makes it really the holy grail for collecting. The rear, of course, is modernized and has a barcode and everything, but it's very tastefully done, and the rest of it is such a beautiful reproduction that it's just a nice way to differentiate. And now these themselves are very collectible. They only did the first 16 volumes, which is unfortunate, but they did actually recreate the original red hardbound design. Everything is recreated to within like an almost ridiculous degree of accuracy, and the front photo is, let's see if I can actually get it open to it. So you have the copyright page, title page, with the only additions being the Applewood Books logo and the 1991 date. And then the original front piece illustration is a nice glossy cardstock, just like you'd get on an original copy. So that's really nice that they did that. And then even the text of the book itself, see the binding on this is really tight. I try to baby these, the few that I have. But the text itself, I don't know where you can see that, is also identical to what you get in an original edition. So these are really great. Like I said, the first 5 or 6 are the ones that are more commonly available. But after that, they start getting much rarer and harder to find. But I'm really impressed with these, and I'm so happy that I now have at least a few of them. And I'd like to go about completing the set, but sometimes the values for, like, say, book 16, the Applewood reprint, get so high up in value that you'd be much better off getting an original Tweed copy, or even one with the dust jacket. So anyway, that's my copy of the original text, the 1927 Leslie McFarlane text. The book was rewritten in 1959, as were the entire original first 38 books in the series. Some only changed a few things. Some were completely different stories with the same title. But overall, the more you read of the original text, you see in the streamlining process that a lot of the character got lost. The character of the story, the feel, they were much more grounded and realistic and three-dimensional. And it's a really interesting experience because I grew up on the revised text to go back, and I've been reading original text whenever I can find them one at a time. And I still like the revised text because I grew up with them, of course, but it's a real eye-opening experience. So if you haven't gotten the chance to do that, I highly recommend it, particularly if there's a favorite book of the first 38 that you have and you haven't read the original text before. But that is not to mean there aren't clunkers in the original text. There's a couple books that are not so good. They had to reinvent for the revised text, just like there are some, revised texts that aren't that good. So it's a mixed bag, because there's always going to be clunkers in everything. So the other 3 copies are, of course, the revised text with the Rudy Nappy artwork. These 2 are the picture cover format, which is the most commonly found. And then, of course, this is the plastic picture cover format that was developed in the late 80s, early 90s, and, of course, is what I was familiar with growing up and what you still see in used bookshops everywhere. This just basically reprints the picture cover form in a plastic binding. What's different about these is this is a slightly earlier copy. This one dates to sometime in the 1960s because it has the brown and white end papers, as you can see here, which is the way you can date this. If you look at the illustrations, they're all from the front covers of the various books, and because this is a copy from the 60s, they still use some of the front covers that were later changed, because most of the books have 2, if not 3, if not 4, sometimes 5 different cover arts through the years. So you can always look at end papers of certain books and be able to date it if you don't know what era the particular type of end paper is. Like for example, if you look here, this is the older broken blade cover. There's a couple other ones. They're slightly different from what the revised ones are. So that's another way to tell if you weren't sure this is a 1960s copy. But the text is all the same as the revised copies, and you get the, see if I can find it. On the copyright page, you get the little blurb saying 1959, and Mr. Dixon has updated this to reflect the most modern police methods and detective techniques, which means this is the not just revised, but completely rewritten version. But anyway, the page count, of course, is a lot more streamlined. Most of these are hitting between 165 to 185 pages, whereas the originals, as you can tell, are a lot thicker and clock in almost always at a bit over 200 pages. Now, this copy, it's a little bit better shape and has the black and white end papers, which is pretty much the same roughly as what you got on the brown and white end papers, but this indicates that it's a copy roughly from the 1970s. They changed them slightly. The exterior of the covers will also change the text. This is where you get into real fan minutia. If you look at the, sometimes the shade of blue will change, but if you look at copies on the shelf of the same book, you can actually start to tell what era they're made by the text they were using. And as they went on, the text got more and more bold, and then eventually they switched to a plain Helvetica style, which didn't really look as nice on the jacket. And then the rear covers roughly stayed the same, but eventually they get more generic looking until you get to the 1980s copies that have really thick, bold black printing and have a completely different end paper on them. And another way, if you really wanted to try and nail down what year your book was made, you'd have to also look at where the listing on the back stopped. Yeah, this one stops at book 52. But it's the same text, the same book, and they just kept reprinting them, but every time they would do that, there'd be a few differences. And also, I don't know if you can notice this, but the newer copy is definitely a bit thinner and has wider pages. And then the plastic cover, which these were printed all throughout into the early 2000s. This is a 1997 printing. It's the same text, same everything, except they added a little listing of the books so you could keep a checklist. But the text, the printing, and everything are still the same. And of course, you have the switch over to the more pencil sketch design that's very iconic for all of the books after a certain point. And of course, you get all the interior illustrations in the revised text, which you don't get in the original text. But otherwise, it's exactly the same. And then all the plastic covers have this same exact rear cover. It doesn't actually talk about the specific book. It's just this same exact rear cover, and it lists the first 6 books and tells you to buy all of them and has a barcode on it. Of course, you have the flashlight motif design that carries over. A lot of fans, there's some love and hate with these. I personally have a lot of fondness for them because I grew up with them, but I already bought, I was a used book nerd already when I was growing up, and loved buying vintage books and digging through bookstores. So when I completed the 58 Canon books, it was a mixture of these plastic covers and then, all kinds of various versions of the picture covers, and then a few tweeds after I completed the 58. So I never had the whole run in plastic, but most of my original books are the plastic covers. I would buy them whenever I've saved up enough money and could afford them, or birthday presents, Christmas presents, and such. But I have picked up a few that I was missing in this, and now I'm just like a couple off from having all of the plastic cover books. And it's still a great way to get them, and the blue looks really nice on a shelf. All of the spines match. So I quite like them, even though, and they are quite sturdy. They're plastic, so they are going to last a bit longer, but they don't have the color depth of the printing of the earlier picture covers. They crop off to certain degrees some of the original art. This one's okay. Some are noticeably cropped more. So the best overall is if you can get minty copies of the picture cover books. preferably earlier printings, but that's not as easy as it used to be, and people may charge $5 or $10 no matter the edition in a used bookshop. So and these are still mostly in print, but they did start a new cover art design back in 2016, 2017, and they did the first 8 books. So there's another more modern edition, which I really haven't bothered with, and I don't know if they're going to continue with that. I wasn't really big on the design, and the actual text inside was unchanged. It's just a new paperback form. So yeah, that's pretty much where I stop with the Canon books. And like I said, I don't know if they're going to continue that reprint series, because really they don't ever have to change these again. Like if they keep these in print like they have, it's going to be perfectly fine. The other thing I should say is, like the picture covers, the printing dates of the plastic covers, there's a little bit of differentiation if you look at, say, a copy from 1995 versus like 2004. Generally, the later books, the binding is a lot tighter, so you have to kind of force them open and hold them open. Whereas the earlier printings, they seem much more easy to read and not as like super rigid on the spines. And then sometimes if you look at certain copies, side to side, sometimes the printing on the cover will be better on one versus another. Why, I don't know. I guess just different print runs. But there can be a little bit of variation in the plastic covers even, but that's much more of like a just maybe they switched printing plants or something. But yeah, out of the ones that I have, I kind of like the older printings from the 90s more because they seem a bit sturdier and less rigid and stuff. But that's just a very minor thing. Now, here are my editions of House on the Cliff, and it's exactly the same as my Tower Treasure books. I have the original text in the applewood reprint, and then a brown end paper early 1960s copy picture cover. It's in really nice shape. And then this is a good condition white end paper 1970s copy. As you notice, there is a little bit of difference in the color of the printing on the actual front cover, but that could be because of age, wear and tear, and but it can also be because of printing variations. So, and if I'm remembering correctly, I do believe this was actually my dad's copy growing up. This was the copy I grew up with, and then I actually picked up the a nice copy of the plastic cover version just to have that one too, because I already have so much, and then if I have like 50 of the 58 in plastic cover, it kind of looks weird to not have the other 8. So every time I realize I'm missing one of those, I just grab it when I find a good cheap copy. So it's exactly the same formats and exactly the same in terms of revised versus original text as Tower Treasure. So the first 16 books were all written by Leslie McFarlane, who created the series essentially. He was given a basic blueprint by the Straightmeyer Syndicate, of the notion that these would be 2 sons of a world-famous detective, and he had the names Frank and Joe Hardy and Fenton Hardy and everything. But then, from a certain point out, everything else was his imagination, and he really is, the father of the series in that regard. So even though the first books aren't really ones that have been completely torn apart or rewritten, just the overall difference, especially in the first 5 or 6 books, is really stunning. Like Tower Treasure is vastly different in terms of tone, but the actual overall plot is roughly the same, and it's like they just cherry picked elements out. But House on the Cliff is an even richer experience when you do this comparison. A lot of people point to the original text of House on the Cliff as the best story in the series, and I can understand why. I don't know if I personally could say which one is the best one because I haven't read all of the original text yet. But I do have favorites like anybody else, but it is such a rewarding book and just a real... Again, it's a real eye-opener going back to the original text, but this one in particular is one of, if not the one, that most diehard fans always point to as like being the great one to always go back to. And that's, again, not to say anything bad about the revised text, which I grew up on, which is also great, but it's one of those where you can totally see what you lost when you read them, especially if you read them back to back, which is what I've been trying to do more recently. and hopefully I can get the rest of the original text I'm missing and do a complete comparison read through, which is something I've always wanted to do and just kept putting off. So this being the applewood, you have the recreation of the spine, and then the original cover, and applewood put these stickers. They're actually printed on here, which is unfortunate, but it does help you tell them apart. If you're looking at listings on eBay and you're like, how can a first edition be $15? That's not right. And then you buy it and it's the reproduction. Still, this an exceptional edition, really well printed, and again, you get the original front piece image. And then on the revised text, again, the brown end papers. And there is the revised text front image with the boys talking to good old Pretzel Pete. Just looking at these upside down brings back a lot of memories. But anyway, so of course, again, all three of these are exactly the same, just reprintings through the years. So 1960s, 70s, and then late 90s here. So these are my copies of Book 3, The Secret of the Old Mill. And here I actually have a mix. I have 2 original text versions and 2 revised text versions. And this one I will get to talk about finally, an older version. And this is what predates the picture covers. This is known most commonly as the tan hardcover or the tweed hardcover. And they came in a variety of different types over the years. Sometimes they're more yellowish, sometimes they have more of a plasticky feel. But this is what, of course, replaced the original red hardbound books. And, of course, they would have a beautiful dust jacket. But, of course, being books sold to kids back in the day, that would be the first thing to go is the dust jacket. So finding copies without the dust jacket is extremely common. But finding copies with a good condition dust jacket is usually very close to impossible, and they will be very expensive. So most of the times you find copies with reproduction dust covers, which can be really impressive. I've just never actually gotten any, but there are some really great ones, and if I'm ever tempted that much, if I don't find originals, I might get some of those. But if you look for original text copies in used bookstores, most of the time you will see a number of these of varying shapes and sizes or from different eras, because again, just like the picture covers have variants through the years, even though it's the same book, so do the original Tweed hardcovers. And again, 99% of the time they're going to be missing their dust jackets. So people have completed whole collections of the Tweeds without any dust jackets. So, but again, it's really cool that you have reproduction dust jackets available should you want them. So this particular copy, show you the spine here, and you have the iconic Hardy Boys logo from this era. Now, because this is, it's still a Tweed, but they used the Tweed up for copies right through into the 50s. So it has the brown and white end papers, which really kind of dates this to being a copy from the late 1950s. It still does have the original text, though. And of course, this copy has some lovely penmanship in here. Another charming thing about buying children's books is you get all of the original owner signatures and all kinds of little charming things. So it's something I personally find kind of endearing. You know, you just pick up copies because they're in good shape, and then you actually open and flip through them, and there's little remembrances of the previous owners, which is, you know, kind of cute. Although apparently they decided all their hair should be dyed blue. But anyway, so this is still the original text, and here's some more. So you have the original image, and of course it's been printed in here. So this is actually printed in ink as opposed to the glossy photo style, but it is the original text. And of course, you know, I looked at the copyright, which here is 1927, which again indicates it's an original text along with original chapters and of course the longer over 200 page count. And you can see on this copy that the actual pages themselves, they haven't tanned at all. They're in really great shape. So this is really another great sweet spot in collecting if you're trying to get original text and not spend a whole lot of money. The Tweeds are a great way to go. Of course, it's very hard to spot quality online if you're looking at eBay listings. But if you're very careful and you look for good copies like this, they're in great shape that have, a good condition cover as well, because the covers on these get very worn and fade over time. In particular editions survive better than others. So these later ones from the 1950s that still have original text are really great ones to go for. If you can find one with the dust jacket, even better. So this is the Applewood reprint, again with their sticker logo here, which you kind of get used to. This has the original cover art, which of course, like most of the books, this book went through several different cover art variations. It has the matching spine, and the Applewoods look really great on a shelf because they all match perfectly, and they have the gold rims on the top and bottom, and then the same rear design. And then to show you the cover image difference, because of course this being the Applewood version, they printed the front image on glossy cardstock. So it's not a drawn image, it's actually an actual printed photo of the original art piece. So that's another really great thing that happened with these, is they brought all of the original art pieces back. So this is the revised text. This is the particular copy I grew up with. It's the picture cover version, and it dates to sometime probably in the early 70s because of the black and white endpapers. And as you can see, apparently somebody decided they were going to start a library and put a new date card in here. So again, you come across things like that I just find really endearing. Also makes me feel a bit old. So here is the revised text front image. And then the copyright page, again with the little blurb saying, in no uncertain terms, yeah, we rewrote this whole book, so don't expect this to be the one you grew up with previously. And then here is the plastic cover version. And this one, the cover printing is really good. It's got nice dark black levels. The color looks really great. So again, there can be some variation on these plastic covers. Sometimes the covers come out well, sometimes not so hot. Sometimes the colors bleed a little bit or it looks a little washed out. But it holds up really well. And again, I like having both because I grew up with a mixture of both. So I do hope to one day complete, a complete run of really great condition copies for both sets, since I have a mixture of both. Now this is one of the ones where I don't have an original text copy. I just have two versions of the revised text. But you will be able to see what I was just talking about here with the plastic cover sometimes not having the color come across well. If you look very noticeably, the cover image here, the colors are very washed out. And of course, it's also cropped on the sides, which they kind of had to do for this banner. But it looks kind of weird, but the skin tone has even changed to almost have this sort of reddish pinkness. I've always loved this particular image, particularly how dark the water is, and it looks very dramatic. So getting the older picture cover copy just really made it jump out more. This is actually the copy I grew up with, and then I later got this one, and then I noticed the extreme difference when I put it on the shelf next to this one. And, especially when you're a kid, at least I always tended to look at the cover of a book and just kind of stare at it all the time, even if I'm not reading a particular book or, you're daydreaming in class staring at the book on your desk. I still do that. I'm sure everybody does, but I always loved covers like this that had really dark, bold colors and were very vivid looking. So that was something that immediately jumped out at me. Of course, otherwise, it is exactly the same text inside. It's the revised text. This has the black and white end papers indicating a 1970s copy. And then flip into, there is the front image and the copyright page, again with the little blurb, which is basically saying this book has been rewritten. Eventually they would just kind of stop with that, but they printed this in all of the first handful of books. And I should also mention they didn't revise them in order. It's not like they started in 1959 and revised and rewrote the first 5. They did the first couple, and then they just kind of hodgepodged all over the place, and it was a bunch of different authors. Sometimes the authors who were writing what would be the new books in the series would actually go back and rewrite some of the older books. So there's no consistency of tone in them at all. And that's not to say there's consistency of tone in the original text, because, of course, those are written by different authors. But different authors usually wrote several. And, of course, Leslie McFarland wrote the first 16 in a row. So there's much more consistency in those versus the revised text in terms of the tone of the same author writing over and over. And, of course, just to give you a quick example, here's the difference in the plastic cover. Of course, these are a lot newer. The pages they actually use, they are still very, very much a bright white. So these will be much, easier to pick up and much cleaner in terms of condition, obviously, as opposed to trying to find a clean picture cover copy from much earlier, because, of course, this book has, roughly 20 some odd years on this one. But as you can see, it is doable. And I should also mention that the iconic blue that's dyed on the top is not on the plastic cover books. So that is only on the picture cover books. So if you're like me, that's definitely a sign of classic books, and something I really loved when series would do that. So the Hardy Boys are very well known for having that on, the whole picture cover era, and most of the Tweeds as well. So that, of course, is another thing you lose on the plastic covers. So here are my additions to Book 5, Hunting for Hidden Gold. Here I have the original text. Here I have an original text and then 2 revised texts. So this, of course, is the applewood version with the matching spine. And then go ahead and show you the front image. Again, really, really beautiful. If you have not ever seen any of these editions before, definitely do yourself a favor and track one down. They are really something else and wonderfully done. I would have been great if they'd been able to do all 38 books, but they did get up to 16. But again, once you get past book 5 or 6, they start dramatically increasing in cost and price, even on the used market all these years later. So, a copy of book 16 will, in the applewood edition, will probably cost you somewhere close to $75 or $100, which is a bit silly, but that's just what they go for, because I'm pretty sure they printed in much smaller quantities. So this is the revised text. This is the edition I grew up with. It's a bit later in terms of printing. The text is a bit bolder, and the rear design has changed a little bit, and of course more titles have been filled in. If I'm correct, I do believe this is from the later 70s. You do have the black and white end papers, but of course more titles on the back. And then the fact that later on in the 70s, they started actually adding the number of the book. They would tuck it up here in the corner next to the title, and just slap it on there, and it's actually printed on there. So they would usually be yellow as well. So that's another indicator that it is a copy from the later 70s. And they would do it in slightly different varieties, but that's just another indicator that you have a copy from later on in the decade. Here's the plastic cover copy I picked up for completion's sake, and this one looks pretty good. But I think it having the bright blue on the sides kind of takes away from the really awesomeness of the Rudy Nappy image. Rudy Nappy, of course, being the artist who painted most of the final cover art variants for the series, and also painted all the later books, who's really one of my favorite artists of all time and completely underrated. So for Volume 6, The Shore Road Mystery, unfortunately all I have is the revised text, which I have here in the plastic cover copy I've had since a kid. Wow. So unfortunately for Volume 6, The Shore Road Mystery, all I have is the plastic cover that I had gotten when I was growing up and collecting the series. Of course, this is the revised art with the final Rudy Nappy artwork, and it's still a nice cover. I just wish I had a good picture cover version and the original text, but it's one of the volumes I've really got to get some other editions for. But this has served me well for a good number of years. As you can see, it opens rather nicely. It's been read a lot. Of course, here is the internal illustration. And, of course, got to have the copyright date. Of course, they weren't printing the revised monikers in these, but I'm not sure if it's in the older editions or not. But, yeah, unfortunately, this is the only version I have of Book 6. So for book 7, The Secret of the Caves, I have 2 volumes. One is the picture cover version, and then here we have the plastic cover version. But what's interesting about this is actually still in the transitional period. So although it carries the Rudy Nappy art from the final version, and it's in the picture cover form, it still contains the original text edition. And of course, if you looked at this compared to later picture covers, you'd notice that the design of the book is a little bit different as it is for older books. So by the brown and white end papers and it containing the original text and listing to Aztec Warrior on the rear cover, this would date probably sometime from the early 1960s, and most importantly, does contain the original text. Here is the opening illustration and the copyright date. And of course, the different chapter contents and the longer page count and the typeface of the original text. So this was a really great find. When I was growing up, I would get various older editions and sometimes wonder why they were different than what I found in Sometimes when I was growing up, I would find copies I would buy used that would be different than what I'd read before in libraries, or copies that I owned that were different, or vice versa, find library copies that were different from the versions I had owned or read before. And I started to kind of put 2 and 2 together, but of course I was a kid, and this was well before the internet was everywhere, and you could actually read fan sites and find great information that you had no access to. So it was really over time that I kind of put things together that they had reworked and reinvented, or then completely rewritten some stories and just kept the same title, and sometimes they changed the cover art as well, sometimes multiple times. So when you're a kid, it's very confusing, first of all, that since they kept using the pseudonym that this author apparently has been writing these books all this time, and but you would get a book with the same title and the contents were different and the front cover was different, and then you found another one with a different cover and a different cover. So it's really cool that they actually held on to the original text sometimes so long that it made it to an edition with the modernized cover art. And again, I love Nappy's artwork and his sense of composition and design and everything. Here you'll notice that on the plastic cover, which is the one I grew up with, the color's a lot darker, and of course it's cropped some. And but this, you get a much better range of color and brightness and everything. So it comes across much better here. And of course, you don't have so much cropped off on the top and sides like you do here. This one's it's perfectly fine. It did the job for many years, but you can tell the difference that happens when you go from the picture cover to the plastic cover. Now, of course, the plastic cover contains the revised text with the front illustration like so, and this would be the easiest way, most likely, to get both text versions. Of course, you can get the applewood version, which I would like to pick up someday, and or get a earlier Tweed hardback, especially one if you can find the dust jacket. But a good number of the original text did make it to the picture cover series, but not all of them did. There's a handful that did not make it, so some people have like cannibalized old books and like actually made their own original text picture covers, which is really awesome. I don't know if I could bring myself to do that to a book, but it just goes to show that if you're at a used bookshop and you look at a bunch of editions and they're all picture covers, it definitely helps to actually look at the actual contents inside, because chances are if it's an older printing, it's very possible for the vast majority of the first 38 that it could still be an original text. And of course, it has the slightly older style of font on the side. So if they're all on a bookshelf next to each other, you can kind of pick out the older editions because they have a much nicer looking font and they're not that bold Helvetica of later editions. And then the rear is a little plainer but better laid out because there's not as many titles crammed in the bottom. And again, it's just these little things that can help you identify that it's an older edition simply by looking at the cover itself. So here are 4 of my Cabin Island copies. My other two won't fit on here, so I'll get to this in just a second. So here we have a variety, but primarily you have the original in the Tweed variety, and then a number of the revised and original text picture covers, which I'll get to in a second. So to first talk about the Tweed copy, as you can see, the actual binding type and the actual material used for the cover is much different. This is usually what some of the older variants will look like. This is definitely an older copy, which you can tell because it has what's referred to as the orange Greta endpapers. The artist's name is Greta, and it came in a number of different varieties, but primarily this orange was used for a while throughout the 30s, 40s, and into the early 50s, which really narrows down when your copy is from. But my own guesstimate is this is probably a copy from the 40s because of the actual rougher type of the binding, and then the actual material has more of a smoothed out feel. Not quite the plasticky type that they seemed to use during World War II, but definitely kind of getting there. If you've ever felt any of these particular copies and kind of know what I'm talking about. The title is still embossed though with the classic logo. So orange Greta end papers, and then the original text with the front illustration and original copyright date, and of course the same typeface and page count of your original text. And then here is a lovely picture cover edition with the final Rudy Nappy art. Here are the brown and white end papers indicating a 60s copy. And same thing, the original illustration and original copyright date. So as you can see, the contents are identical. And this is another one of these awesome original texts in a picture cover disguise. Of course, this is an early version that lists only up to Mystery of the Desert Giant, indicating that it's definitely earlier on in the 60s. And it has the more relaxed style rear cover that is going to reflect also an earlier copy. I never intended to pick up multiples, but as you can see, the cover is a bit different depending on which edition you look at. Here it's a bit lighter. The sky is has a little bit of reddish in the gray. Here it's a lot cleaner and it's a lot clearer. This is probably the best of these three. And this again is also another original text. This one a bit later as it lists up to Mystery of the Aztec Warrior. You notice the blue is a bit darker on the back and the spine, but it's still the same. You have the brown and white end papers and the same interior. This copy is in much better shape, of course. So again, this is just from a couple years down the road to show you the difference in spine. You can see the blue is a little bit different, but the text is overall the same, and the number is the same. Those are usually the giveaways that one copy is earlier or later because they would switch up fonts. Now this last one here, this is the revised text in picture cover form. So you'll notice again another change. The text is a bit bolder, and then here's the rear of the original text edition, and here's the rear of the revised text. And as you can see, they go up a bit further in titles, indicating that it's from later on. And by now we've switched over to the black and white end papers, indicating this copy is from sometime probably in the early 70s. And then to flip to, there's the revised art and the revised copyright date of 1966. So now to talk for a brief moment about the plastic cover copies. Again, this is the revised text. Again, it's the same art. You can see, again, there are already variances. Here, it kind of looks much like this particular version, has a little bit of reddish in the sky, but it's very, very bold in its color, and the black levels come across a lot more. Whereas this one, it looks a bit more grayed out, kind of like this one, kind of like this one. So again, if you put a bunch of copies side by side, they don't all come out the same. It's like when um, it's very much like when they made old dye transfer Technicolor film prints back in the day. No two dye transfer prints were ever the same, but they all had beautiful color and they never faded. But it just was the process of making them. So it's the same for these picture covers, whether it's in the plastic era or before. Now, these, of course, are both the revised texts and everything, but the reason why I wanted to showcase these, this is one I picked up in one of those, they used to sell sets and packs of like 10 or 20 books, and so I got a couple of those growing up to get certain titles, but that meant I wound up with duplicates of some. But this particular copy here is the one that got me started. This was the first Hardy Boys book I ever came across. It just happened to turn up on our childhood bookshelf growing up, where it was just various children's books from different places. I don't know who bought it or how it got there, but it was suddenly there, and I was mystified by it. And then finally one day I picked it up and read it and could not put it down, and that started me on this whole path. And I've read it and reread it more times than I can possibly remember. But it's still held up well. It's got a little bit of wear on the corners, whereas of course this copy doesn't. But this is the particular copy that got me started on the Hardy Boys in general, and getting into the Hardy Boys growing up and starting to collect them is what got me really into literature, and not just book collecting, but just literature and books in general, and trying to find out what more was out there. So this particular copy and this story, even though it is the revised text, it's got a special place in my heart because of that. So it's very important to me for that particular reason, and that's why it's the most special out of all of the editions that I have in my collection. And it's simply for that nostalgia and for being the gateway, the gateway book. So here we have my 3 versions of Book 9, The Great Airport Mystery. And here, this is the first one that I actually have the dust jacket for the original text in hardcover. This, of course, is not the first cover. This is the second cover art design. And this is when they had switched over to having the yellow spines. And so collecting all of the original text with the yellow spine jackets is yet another form of trying to complete a Hardy Boys set. If you're looking at the applewood versions, they kept with the original cover jackets, but after a certain point, they just stuck with the way they were making them. So the last couple of those, they still have the white spines and they still have the red hardcovers. So those are not exactly perfect replicas for the last couple books. So anyway, this is the second jacket, and this one, it still has the orange Greta in papers. So that would date this probably sometime in the probably the mid to late 40s, and then eventually they switched over to the brown in papers sometime in the late 50s or so. So because of this jacket and still having the orange in papers, it's probably sometime from the mid to late 40s, early 50s or so. And again, this is sort of a it's sort of a guessing game. There's not, it's not like they actually print the real printing date on every copy, which would be great, but that also adds to the fun of collecting Hardy Boys, is you have to sit there and try and figure out the date of the printing of your own particular copy. So here's the original art, and the original copyright date, and of course the original chapter listing, because these are longer books. Again, if none of this makes any sense and you happen to pick a book up off a shelf in a used bookshop and you open it up and it looks much more like this, then you're pretty much looking at an original text copy. Of course, the ultimate giveaway is that the actual book is different. So here are the revised versions in the picture cover format and the plastic cover format. So this copy, of course, is probably from sometime in the early to mid 70s because of the black and white end papers. These, of course, are the most common you'll find, and if you find these in good shape, these are still great copies to have, and definitely the best to have for the revised text. If you're not a fan of the plastic covers. but it's getting more difficult to even find these copies in good shape these days in used shops and eBay and such. This is the revised art, and of course the revised copy date. And of course the plastic cover. This one actually translates the art really well. It doesn't crop too much off anywhere, and the color comes across well. You will notice it does kind of have this flat sheen look to it, which all plastic cover copies will have versus the original. But what's really cute is that, you know, here on the side, the classic red circle logo will always come through a little bit usually. And I guess when they were doing the copying, this is one of the ones where it actually starts to pink through, which I always thought was cute. Because, you know, as a kid, you're like, what's that? Is the plane on fire in the background? But if you notice, it's a perfect circle, you know, so it's just, it happened every once in a while on these, but, you know, if somebody didn't crop that out and just forgot or didn't notice. So you'll see that on some plastic cover copies that the actual classic red circle logo will be peeking through a little bit. So here are my 3 copies of What Happened at Midnight. And here we have, these 2 are actually the same. I just happened to find another really awesome condition copy that was a little bit in a little bit better shape. I just still have the other one. But anyway, so here we have 2 original text editions and the revised text with the final cover and the plastic cover edition. So these 2 are both original text. This is the second cover of the book, and most editions, if you looked at all of them over the years, this was around for the most of its life. But of course, this 1960s cover has now been around for an extremely long time. But we have the brown and white endpapers. Here's the original art and the original copyright date. So this probably dates from sometime in the early 60s, I would say. Because, of course, it's not a hardcover with dust jacket, but it has the second art and it has the original text. This one, like I said, it's exactly the same. It's just in a little bit better shape. As you'll notice, this one, it has a little bit of wear where some of the paint has worn off over time. You see this sort of, it's almost like a crosshatch pattern when you look at the picture covers at a very, very close angle, or it catches the light just right. I'm always amazed at how well these hold up, but sometimes, like this one, particularly the books from the picture covers from the 50s and 60s, they're much more prone to, you know, having wear and having the paint wear away. But you see, this one is perfectly fine. So this one, I guess, was maybe not stored in direct sunlight for a long time or something, but of course the color is a little bit different now because this one's it's got some fading here of the color. But if you're not even looking at that, the overall color is a little bit different because, again, every time they printed these, they seem to come out a little bit different. Now here on the revised text, again, lovely Rudy Nappy art, but of course it's a different book, and it's got much, you can tell it's, you know, obviously from much later on, and it sort of has a 60s vibe to it. I really love almost all the covers anyway, so I still really love this, and I would like to one day have the original dust jacket version with the original cover, but this is of course the plastic cover version. And to briefly show you the art, and of course, no copyright date. I should mention, though, it technically does have the copyright date, because if you look here, it's basically listing the renewals and the reprint dates. But if you go back, it will list earlier dates, and then you can see sort of the hierarchy, and then usually the original printing date is actually down there, tucked away. But of course, if you weren't looking for that, you wouldn't know it was there. And that, of course, is referring to the original book, not the rewritten one. So here we have my books of While the Clock Ticked. Of course, we have one original text, obviously, and then all 3 of these are revised texts. This is definitely in rougher shape, but it's actually the first Tweed version that I ever picked up as a kid growing up, and seeing them every once in a while in bookstores, very, very infrequently when I was growing up, I must say that. So this was the first one I ever found, and I definitely jumped on it. It's definitely the worst for wear, but as you can see, it's got a much thicker binding, and it's actually a very thick book. So I've always felt this is probably a much earlier example, but again, I don't know for certain. It does have the original orange Greta endpapers, and again, it's very, very worn by now, but it does have the printed glossy photo card for the opening image. And again, I have to do this very carefully because the binding is very, very flimsy. And you have this old order form with the advertising for the Ted Scott stories and the original copyright date. So all these indicators, of course, it would be helpful if it had the dust jacket, but I'm pretty sure this is a copy from the 1930s, if not perhaps the early 40s. And I don't know if it's from the early 30s, but I'm just guessing. So all these indicators, it's probably one of, if not my oldest actual copy of anything that's, an actual early edition and not a reproduction. But it's just definitely the first Tweed that I ever found. And again, it's seen a lot of wear and tear over the years, but it's actually still, holding together. And, it's my one go-to copy of the original text and the one I've had the longest probably. Here is the version I grew up with in terms of this is the version I had before I got the Tweed. As you can see, it has some of the same color wear that the last book did. Anyway, this is the revised text with the final Rudy Nappy art, which is super dramatic from the climax. And the rear, it's a little worn, but still pretty serviceable. Has the black and white end papers, and I believe most copies of this do. I think they revised this one earlier on, and so here's the revised front art. And the new copyright date of 1962. So this being one of the ones they revised much earlier on, finding original texts of this is a lot more difficult. Because from 62 through about the late 70s, all of the picture cover copies will be the revised text. So this one's in a little bit better shape, but I think this one is a little bit later because, of course, more titles are listed on the back. And, of course, the blue is a little bit darker, but it's still got the same end papers and everything. As you can see, this one's a little bit bolder in terms of color, and it's a little bit darker. So, of course, if this didn't have the fading, it would look a little better. But you can see side by side, there's a little bit of difference. So again, this is probably a couple years younger. And then here we have the plastic cover, which again, cover art looks pretty good. It's such a great composition anyway. You really can't wreck it. But of course, it's now got an L-shaped crop on it. But it's still good and solid, and just another great in the plastic cover series. But of course, it doesn't really have the same wow factor as the picture covers do. And of course, the original dust jacket, the very first one, is a really bold, striking one because it's got a very bold sort of orange sunset background. It's a very dramatic image. So again, hopefully one day when I manage to complete my goal of having every different cover art, I can put them all side by side. So unfortunately for 12, 13, and 14, all I have are the plastic cover revised texts with the final nappy art on them. And these books still really hold up well, but I just haven't gotten all the original text yet, unfortunately. I have a good number of them across different editions, Tweeds, picture covers, but I'm now really trying to focus on at least picking up a form of the original text for the ones that I have not yet. Of course, these all have had multiple different cover arts, and these are all, heavily revised from what their original versions were. And you can see they're all three, the covers especially, show a much more action orientation, which is fine by me because I started reading these because they had action and adventure in them along with the mysteries. But I love the composition of these. I've always loved them. Particularly the mark on the door, the composition is brilliant, but definitely the winner of the three has to be the nappy art for Hidden Harbor Mystery. It's just extraordinarily dramatic, and when you were a kid and you were sitting in school and your book had people almost eaten by an alligator on the cover in the middle of a hurricane, that's drama. So here is the, I guess since I'm doing this for all of these, here is the revised art for Footprints Under the Window. Here we go for the mark on the door. Very much preempting Indiana Jones there, so that definitely gives you the action orientation. And then the opening art for Hidden Harbor Mystery. If I can flip these pages, of course. As soon as they stick, and it's hard to do upside down. Here are my two editions of the Sinister signpost. And here we have an original text. This is the, I believe this is the second cover art in the picture cover form. And here we have the revised text with the final art in the plastic cover form. This was one of the ones that was revised later on in the 60s, so you can much more easily find original text copies. I had an older version, and then I actually found this version, so this is actually an upgrade. It was just in better shape. And you can also tell the difference in the storytelling, because while the revised text has the original plot elements, they add in a lot more, and it's definitely you have the whole action tinge is right on the front cover and really dramatic, but it also seems like a completely different story. So here we have, because it is a completely different story. So here we have the brown and white endpapers. This copy is probably from the 1960s, because again, this wasn't revised until later on in the decade. And we have the original art and copyright date. And here is the revised version. I'd like to one day get this in a good picture cover form, because again, I love all of the nappy art, even though some aren't fans of certain covers that he did. I really love all of them, and I'd love to have them in the picture cover format as well. Here's my two editions of A Figure in Hiding. This one, unfortunately, I don't have the original text for. This is the picture cover, but from later on in the 70s. This is when they, in addition to just adding the number on the cover, they actually put a blue bar on the top. So this predates them doing the plastic cover. You can see where they got the idea from, and the blue kind of extends over onto the spine. So they were already doing this back in the day. So you'll see this on certain copies. I don't know if all of the Canon books got printed this way, but a significant number of them do. I don't really collect this particular style, but it's just the copy that I grew up with. As you can see, this one is one of those where I really noticed the plastic cover. They really brighten the image, whereas this one, it looks a lot nicer. But of course, it's practically equally cropped on both sides. But yeah, this is one of those where you can notice it's definitely brightened a bunch. It says the black and white endpapers. So this is probably from the late 70s, because I believe that's when they started doing the blue bar on the cover. And you have the revised art and copyright date. And of course, the plastic cover is exactly the same. It's just a newer printing. So here are my two copies of The Secret Warning, and it's the same thing. I don't own an original text edition, and my picture cover copy is also from the 70s. You can tell by the addition of the number up here, but it doesn't have the thick blue bar on the top. So this is probably from sometime in the early to mid 70s when they started adding the number on the front cover. And then to show you the rear, you can tell it's already got the Helvetica font. And there's a lot more titles on here, so this is definitely a 70s copy. It's got the black and white endpapers. Here is the front art and the copyright date. And of course, again, the plastic cover is the same. Again, the art is brightened and the color comes across different. And also some details are obscured, like the actual light and the lighthouse and some of the faces and the actual color of their shirts. Again, you're only going to see that when you're comparing it side by side. And this is, a 70s copy, not even like an earlier minty copy. So it's just another time where you can see how they didn't really translate the cover perfectly when they did the scans sometimes, or maybe it was the printing process, but no two covers are exactly alike. Here we have my editions of the Twisted Claw. Here I have 2 original text forms and then the revised and plastic cover. Here is the Tweed, and again, this is sort of that almost plasticky feeling type that I was kind of mentioning before. You can tell it has sort of a slick-ish feel to it. Doesn't really have that cloth-bound type cover that you get on the, legitimate Tweed ones. So it has the orange Greta endpapers. And there is the front art and the copyright date. So this edition is probably from sometime in the 40s or 50s. This one was, I believe, according to the website, hardyboys.us, which is the world's greatest resource for Hardy Boys. I believe the orange end papers lasted until about the late 50s. So that would be my guess in trying to date this particular copy. And then here on this is actually the second cover art, and it's in the picture cover form, so this is definitely from the 1960s. So here you have the brown and white end papers, and you still have the same artwork and the same original text and copyright date. But again, less titles on the back, and I believe this basically ran from the early to right up until this book was revised in the late 60s. And here we have the final art on the revised version. This is the plastic cover. Again, it's very bold in color, and the composition is really interesting. It's very much in your face. Again, I love when these would get really bold. It's not really for everybody. Some fans don't like the bolder, nappy covers, but I really do. Then to show you the new art and the date. So here we have my 3 editions of Book 19, The Disappearing Floor. And here we have 2 original texts and 1 revised text. What's interesting about this one is, because this was a title that was revised in the early to mid-60s, these 2 editions were not around for very long. So these are, you can pretty much narrow down to a very short window of time. Again, using the amazing information on hardyboys.us, I've been able to kind of pinpoint this as being late 50s and early 60s. Both are original text. This is the Tweed hardcover, of course, without its dust jacket. But it has the brown and white end papers and the original art and original text. There's the copyright page. And then they transitioned over into the picture cover. So this probably would have had the dust jacket with this art on it. And this is actually the second art. There was only 2 arts for this particular book. And then same thing, brown and white end papers, original art. So the actual page content is probably almost identical on these books. They're almost the same size and type and everything. So yeah, this one took over from the Tweed series and then was very quickly replaced by the revised text that had the exact same cover and was also a picture cover book. And then here is the plastic cover variant with the revised text. So this is what I was used to. This particular story, original text-wise, is not very well regarded. There's a particular run of books among really dedicated fans that, depending on certain authors being, perhaps better at writing these books than others, to put it politely, Certain books, this one in particular has a reputation in the original text for being, a bit dodgy. The revised text is pretty good. But again, I like reading all of them. It may be just me. I like seeing it when they hit it out of the park, when maybe they don't, they're middling. So you get a whole range in both the original text and the revised text, which is kind of interesting. Of course, there's the modern copyright page. For Mystery of the Flying Express, again, all I have is the revised text in the plastic cover form. So here you have the final Rudy Nappy artwork, and if I'm remembering correctly, this title was revised relatively late. Has a definite, a definite later vibe in terms of the art. Show you the revised art. And the modernized copyright page. I do really want to get the original text, so I mean, like all of them, and this one does have at least, I believe it has 3 different cover arts, so hopefully I can pick up an original text version with one of the earlier artworks. Here we go with Clue of the Broken Blade, and I have 3 editions. These 2 are the same. They're picture covers with the second art. This book actually has 4 distinct, different cover art versions, and some are almost the same. The first 3 all feature some form of Frank and Joe with the broken blade in a room of sorts, whereas this one goes on for the full-on sort of semi-abstract mode, and it's a really striking image, but it's totally different because, of course, it's an art design that started in the 70s. So these both have the original text and are both in the picture cover form. This one's a little bit worn, but it has the brown and white end papers, and there's the original art and the copyright page. Again, this copy is in much better shape, so I do believe, actually this one I believe is maybe slightly earlier. You see, yes. So I should have put this one first. This one's actually earlier. It lists to Desert Giant, whereas this one lists up to Aztec Warrior. And again, you'll notice the actual blue coloring on the background is a little bit different in terms of tone, and the text is a bit different because, of course, less books are on this one. And again, even the spines are a little different. So you can find all kinds of minute little variations in these all the time. Again, here is the plastic cover with the revised text and the final cover. Nappy actually painted 2 different arts for this, so the last 2 art editions are his. There's the revised art and modern copyright page. Here we have my 3 copies of the Flickering Torch mystery, the first 2 being original text and this being the revised text. There were 3 cover art. You see the second and third here. This is the Tweed edition, and this is the one with brown end papers. So this is probably from the time of the changeover. So this would have been right as they were ending these in the late 50s. I believe it's 1958 to about 61 or so, and then immediately pick up with these picture covers. So show you the art page and the copyright. And again, like the Disappearing Floor, this copy is from very shortly thereafter and is the identical contents, page layout, end papers. So pretty much, again, it's like they just took the pages out and just changed the cover type. And then here, the revised text, which this is one of the stories that's very heavily revised, and the plot has changed so much so, and is very much influenced by being from a much later time. Again, you have sort of the abstract design that was used on a lot of the later cover arts, but again, the whole psychedelic element there and the notion of being a folk rock / rock band is definitely dated from the late 60s. So here is the revised art and the modern date. So here we have 2 editions of the Melted Coins, this being the original text and the revised text. This again is one of the few I have the dust jacket for. It's a nice Tweed copy, and again, this seems to date from the last period of the Tweed covers. The second cover that happened was only on the picture cover variant, as far as I know. So this cover actually made it through until they stopped making the hardcover Tweed books. So it has the brown and white end papers and the original art and copyright page. Show you what the rear looks like. This is advertisement. This is an advertisement for the Tom Swift Jr. series. Again, one of the other siblings, if you will, of the Straight Matter Syndicate. And then here's the revised text with the final Rudy Nappy cover, which, again, much more in the abstract style with specific objects that was he would use in the late 60s, early 70s. Here's the revised art and the modern copyright page. This one's pretty easy. All I have for the Shortwave mystery is the revised text in the plastic cover form. So, again, the art's really nice, but on this copy I've always noticed, here you have the red logo creeping in, and because of the printing, it's made Frank look like, a lobster face man. So, it's just always something that cracked me up. On this particular copy, I would like to get the original text, of course, and the picture cover copy, and hopefully have one where Frank isn't completely red lobster man face. Show you the art. So there is the revised art and a modern copyright page. And here we have book 25, The Secret Panel. These are the 4 editions that I have. This one is the original text, and there are only 2 covers for this book, so it's either the original cover or the Rudy Nappy final cover. And, this cover's fine. It's definitely of its time period, but this is another one where, again, Nappy's composition, I think, really sells the excitement and danger and mystery aspects of the book a lot more. But again, I'm much more used to this version as far as the cover's concerned. Now this one has a distinct little difference. You notice here has this is actually printed on, it's not a sticker, but it's a little box saying that this copy is $1. Apparently this was a short-lived run of the books from, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, it's listed as 1962 on the Hardy Boys site. So that's something you'll note if you look at a lot of these old copies, and you'll note some of them have what looks like it's a sticker, but it's actually printed on there saying that it was $1. So that's a particular variant. And of course, being an older picture cover, it's a little bit thicker. The blue is a little bit different color. And, of course, it only lists to Mystery of the Desert Giant on the back. You have the brown and white end papers. The original art there. And the original copyright date. This here's the revised text. And this book wasn't revised until the late 60s. So they pretty much all have the black and white end papers. So this is probably from, any time between 1969 and right up through the early to mid 70s. Here's the revised art and copyright page. Well, this actually tells you it's a 1970 printing, so that's definitely not common. I forgot to mention they do that sometimes, but very infrequently. So this is one of the few times you can actually tell when your book was made. This is a later printing because you can see they've added the actual number on the front cover. And, of course, the titles are in Helvetica and a lot bolder, and you have the whole list there. And they've also changed the top logo. This is the one edition I have and what's referred to as the Cameo version, basically saying that Frank and Joe are making a cameo in their own book on these end papers. This is what you would get in 1980s copies. So this is what they looked like until they started the plastic series, and I believe it was 1987 as when they started the plastic covers. So If you bought the books anytime from about, I believe, 1979, 1980 up through 1987, they would have these Cameo style end papers. But of course, the book itself is exactly the same. You'll notice on this copy, it's a lot lighter. It's very contrasty. It's not that this book is worn down. I don't know if it sat out in sunlight for a while or something, but it is naturally more contrasty. And sometimes I wonder if they scanned some of these particular copies when they made the plastic covers. As you can see, this copy, it's a little bit whited out looking. It's a bit contrasty, not quite as bad as this. But if you notice, comparing it to the older 1970 copy, that this has a lot more color depth and the black levels look a lot richer and things like that. But again, you're not going to notice this stuff unless you're looking at them side by side by side by side. So here we have my two copies of book number 26, The Phantom Freighter. This is the original text edition in the picture cover format with the original cover art. This book only has two cover arts. This has the brown end papers and lists to the desert mystery of the desert giant on the back, so it probably dates it to about 1961 or so. This was one of the later books to be revised, so it's much easier to find original text copies floating around. And here is the original artwork and title page, and the original copyright page. Here is the revised art by Rudy Nappy, and it's very much more of a, I don't know exactly the word you'd say, but it's very abstract. I know some fans aren't a fan of this cover, but I pretty much like all of the original Canon arts, so I don't really mind it. Of course, it's in the plastic cover format, so you have the blue, which kind of really contrasts with the overall yellow. And then there is the art and title page and revised copyright page. So here we have The Secret of Skull Mountain, and I have 4 copies, 3 original text and then 1 revised text. Trying to date these, this is the, of course, Tweed hardback version minus its dust jacket. It's in really nice shape, but it doesn't have a book list in it. It has the orange Greta end papers and, of course, the original art and copyright date, which, of course, this book was released in 1948. So since there's no book listing, I would hopefully assume it's a first printing, but it could be a bit later. There's not exactly a way to note for sure, but it does have the slightly lighter color of the brown tweed, and it's much more sturdy, which is like the later tweed copies. So it's probably not a first printing. It's probably from sometime in the 50s, I would guess, because most of my brown tweeds that look like this are later printings, and of course they're usually in better shape because they haven't had quite as much time to be greatly loved and abused. So these two are the original text with the original cover art in picture cover form. As you can tell, there's a definite color and printing difference between the two. This is a slightly earlier copy from about 61 or so. This is slightly later from about 64 or so. Same book, same text, same everything as the Tweed version, but just in picture cover form, and you can clearly see how sometimes, to the naked eye, two identical books are slightly different just depending on who was working at the printers that day or where it was printed. So this one has a little bit of damage, but the color is just a lot richer compared to this copy, which I had first. And then here is the revised text in plastic cover form. So I'll show you the art. And, of course, modern copyright page. So here we have my copies of Sign of the Crooked Arrow, book number 28. 3 editions. As you can tell, this is one of the few tweeds I have or at least a surviving dust jacket for. Of course, it's very common. If you do find a copy with a dust jacket, it's going to be beat up. So this one's actually in pretty good shape, and you can tell the difference in terms of color and color depth and such. As always, a lot richer on the dust jackets if they do survive. Of course, the picture covers have been sitting on shelves and in direct sunlight for years and years, so Usually these haven't held up as much as the dust jackets, but of course the dust jackets are the first thing to go on the original hardcovers. So of course it's the same art, same text. This copy has the orange Greta end papers, and then the book listing stops at Crooked Arrow. So I would assume this is an original printing from 1949 then. Of course, it could be a little bit later, but that's usually the best way to tell. Sometimes they didn't update the book listings, though. And then this copy lists to Aztec warrior, so it's probably from the 60s, from about 64 or so, with the brown and white multi-scene end papers, and of course the same artwork, as it's the same original text. And then here's the revised text with the final cover. And there's the revised art with the modern copyright page. Another thing I will note that makes me also think this is an original copy. Let's see if I can unfold this so you can see. Taking out the dust jacket will reveal that this has a much darker. This is the type of tweed. It's still got the sort of rough hewn tweed feel to it, but it's almost got this sort of like rubbery quality, which is very strange, almost plastic. So this was used for a little while, primarily on 1940s copies. I think I've heard some places or on some fan sites say that a lot of World War II era copies were printed this way for probably terms of material shortages and such. So you'll see copies pop up like this sometimes, and of course they don't match the other tweeds. So like I've been saying, tweed hardcovers, you can have a whole shelf of them and they can all appear drastically different, even though it's the same book series. These are my copies of The Secret of the Lost Tunnel. Again, you have two cover arts, and you have original text and revised text. This copy dates to about 1964 because the book list goes to Mystery of the Aztec Warrior, which was published in 1964. And that's usually the easiest way to date copies, is by looking at the book list on the back and seeing what's the last book. So that kind of lets you know that it's around that year, so 64, 65 or so. And then this, of course, is a modern plastic cover reprint from the late 90s, early 2000s. Again, with the books about this time period, it is a lot easier to get original text because they were around a lot longer. It's a lot harder to get certain books that were, not as available in the original form as long as others. This, of course, has the brown and white end papers, and to show you, here's the original art. And again, it's always a dead giveaway that it'll be sort of boxed in like this and have the quote on the bottom, and it just has a style of its own. And so that's a very easy giveaway that it's in this formatting for the front illustration. And there's the copyright page. Whereas here on the revised text, you get the more streamlined art that's pretty much the same and identical to the style of all the revised texts, and then the modern copyright page. And the same goes for the Wailing Siren Mystery. You have original and revised text and two distinct cover arts. So again, pretty easy to get original text of this one, pretty easy to tell them apart because they literally just have different covers. This, of course, since it also lists Aztec warriors, probably from about 64, 65, has the brown and white end papers. And here is the front piece art with copyright page. And then this is a wonderfully dramatic Rudy Nappy artwork, and as you can tell, the art style around this time period for the series, they can kind of vary in terms of, they usually have a lot of bright colors, but they're usually very, I'm trying to think of the right word. It's not generic, it's not quite laid back, but it doesn't really have a whole lot of drama sometimes, and as you can see, there's a lot of dead space on covers of this era. But they're still nice paintings. But the revised text in this case, the drama is definitely a lot more in your face. This, of course, is the plastic cover printing. And there is the front art, a lot more menacing this time. And then the modern copyright page. And they always had the recycle logo there, so that's another, easy giveaway, of course, besides the fact that it's the plastic hardcover. So here are my editions of The Secret of Wildcat Swamp, and I have 3 original texts and then the revised text. These books are actually all very close to each other. As you can tell on the 2 Tweeds, there's a slight difference in the color and the consistency of the Tweed, and that goes into what I'm always talking about how you can look at a whole shelf of Hardy Boys original Tweed hardbacks, and they all have a different color, and they've all aged in different ways, simply because the printing really varies across the whole time frame of the Tweed hardbacks. So these are both original texts. They both have the orange Greta endpapers, but by looking at the book listing, you can tell that this is actually a first printing because it actually ends in the listing for Wildcat Swamp. So there's the Greta endpaper, and then here is the older style listing, and as you can see, it ends in this particular book. So this should be an original 1952 printing. There's the original art. And of course, the copyright page says 1952. And then looking at this copy, you can tell the binding's a little different. The color of the Tweed's a little different. It also has the orange Greta endpapers. And has, of course, the more modernized book listing. And that lists to the Hooded Hawk mystery, which would have come out in 1954. So that leads me to guess that this is probably a copy from about 1954. Has the same, of course, for the rest of the book and the original art and everything. This copy's in a little bit better shape, and sometimes you just collect for what you can find, or upgrade copies, or just whatever's cheaply available. So sometimes I've wound up with a couple different copies of the same book. And then here is the original text in picture cover form, and then it lists to Desert Giant on the back, which dates it to about 1961 or so. You have the brown and white multi-scene endpapers. Have the more modern book listing continuing there. And then there's the artwork. So everything else is the same. Of course, the revised text has the final cover. And that it's always kind of bizarre. I mean, this is definitely very abstract because apparently they're being menaced by a bobcat that's some mutant giant monstrosity, which of course is not in the book. Hey, that's dramatic license for you. There's the new art and the modern copyright page. Here's my copies of the Crisscross Shadow. Original and revised text, obviously, and it's like with the others. Once you hit about books numbered, the mid-20s to the mid-30s, it's a lot easier to get original text because they were around for a little while, and they're easy to tell because the covers are either very similar or of the same style, and they're available in picture cover form. So this dates to probably about 1964. Brown and white endpapers and lists to Aztec warrior. So that's always my educated guess. Here's the original art and copyright page. And then the revised text has a much more dramatic cover, but of course the same idea, the same central solution to the mystery. There's the revised art, modern copyright. Here are my 2 copies of Book 33, The Yellow Feather Mystery. Again, 2 cover arts, original picture cover, and revised plastic cover. And this one lists up to the Haunted Fort, so it's probably from about 1965. You still have the brown and white endpapers, of course. Then here's the original art and copyright page. And the revised text, I have to say, this is I really love some of the revised text covers so much that while the original art is really good, this is one of those examples where the revised art is really impressive and definitely has a style to it that ties into other covers that Rudy Nappy did around this time period, both of what were then current and then books like this that were the revised text editions. Because, like I've said before, they did the revised texts all out of order. So they were rewritten and published, from the mid to late 50s all the way through the 70s. Unfortunately, all I have for the Hooded Hawk mystery is the revised text in plastic cover form. Again, this is in the style that the art was going in later on in the 70s, where you have the big central figure, usually figuring into the mystery somehow, and then the boys, somewhere in the background. So it looks like they're dealing with a giant mutant hawk that's 20 feet tall. Here's the interior art and copyright. Here I have 3 copies of The Clue in the Embers, 2 original texts and 1 revised text. This is one of the few I have the whole dust jacket for. The book is from 1955, but this one lists to Ghost at Skeleton Rock, which came out in 1957, so I would guess this is probably from about then. Still have the orange Greta endpapers. Here is the artwork and copyright. And then just to show you the Tweed is that much lighter but much sturdier type of all of the 1950s printings. Then the picture cover, it looks really, really good. So if you manage to get good condition picture covers, they do hold up really well versus the much harder to find in good shape Tweeds with intact dust jackets. But of course, it's the same text inside, but with the brown and white end papers. Now here on the revised text, I really love this. Again, the central figure on this cover is a shrunken head, so it looks really, really dramatic. This printing is from sometime in the 1970s, probably later on in the decade, because as you can see, they had already put the number on the front cover, which is something they started doing later in the 70s, and it would always be yellow, tucked up here somewhere right above the title. And then after that, they switched and eventually put the big blue bar across the top, which really prefigures the plastic cover versions. But it still has the black and white multi-scene end papers, which would, of course, indicate that's from the 1970s. Here's the revised art and copyright page. So again, I would guess, judging by the rear cover listing to the hissing serpent, this is probably from about 1974 or so. For Secret of Pirate Hill, I only have 2 copies of the revised text. I have a nice picture cover copy here from the 70s and the plastic cover reprinting. As you can tell, you lose a bit in terms of dimension because of the border. This copy is printed much lighter as opposed to this being much darker and looking much more impressive in person. You can see it has the number printed on, in addition to having the rear having the much bolder, pretty much it's Helvetica style font, which they started using later on in the 70s. And this lists to the Witchmaster's Key, which would put this probably about 1976 or so. You have the black and white end papers, and here is the artwork, copyright page. And of course, the plastic cover is exactly the same because they are both the revised text. Here we have The Ghost at Skeleton Rock with the original and revised text, again with both cover art variations. This copy dates to about 1964 because, again, it lists to Aztec Warrior as the brown and white end papers. As you can see, somebody used this as their own personal lending library copy because it still has the date due card stuck in there. It's another great charming thing about getting vintage copies is you find original signatures and names and all kinds of things in there. So there's the original art, copyright date, and then the revised As you can see, the art is very, very similar. Just, of course, they changed the date and time. And then the interior art is actually the same, which did not always happen, but this is one of the rare occasions where they simply reused the original artwork. Here are my 2 copies of Mystery at Devil's Paw with the original and revised text with both cover art variations. This copy is not in the best shape. You can see the spine is very much cracked. But this was actually one of the first picture covers and original texts I ever got as a kid. It was actually this particular book that I started to realize the difference, because I had either read a copy in a library first, or I read this copy I bought used first, and then somehow found the revised text and noticed that it felt a bit different. This is one that is only slightly altered. It still has the same general plot, but of course it's a slimmer volume and was rewritten a number of years down the road. But it just felt weird. And then I actually got the revised text from the library, took it home, and put them side by side, and noticed that this had extra chapters and it was a lot longer. It was over 200 pages, whereas this is about, the usual revised text run length of 170 to 180 in terms of page count, and it had different art on the cover, different art on the interior, and I'm like, okay, what is going on here? So it was actually this particular book, and it's really ironic because this is the last of the revised text. So starting with the next volume, it's all up to date. Starting with book 39, they are just one text. So it's ironic that the last of the original texts that was ever published is the one that I picked up on as a kid and realized that I was not done reading the Hardy Boys, not by a long shot. So this is, of course, definitely worn down, but it's important to me because it was the book that I realized all this stuff started on. And it must have been from the same person, same kid who owned Skeleton Rock, because it has the same handwritten date due card. And this one was actually checked out to somebody apparently in 1968. So there you go. Brown and white endpapers. It lists to Mystery of the Desert Giant, which probably puts it at least a 1961 printing, judging by the back cover. So there is the interior art. Whoops. Copyright page. Here's the revised art in plastic cover form, and I do plan to hopefully get all of the revised in picture cover form as well, because I do really like the art, even though it's a more abstract style. And of course, it looks much more dramatic when it's all white as a background instead of having the blue plastic cover banner on the top and sides. Just to show you the interior art. And modern copyright. And here's where it all gets easy. Starting with book number 39, The Mystery of the Chinese Junk, it is all one text. So this was the first of the books to never have been revised. This is, of course, the plastic cover version, and I hope to one day get a nice picture cover version. I really do like the cover. The color's really nice. And this is one of the plastic covers that they've done well. They usually did a very good job. It just, like with the picture covers, it depends on who was working at the print manufacturer that day and how did this particular run come off the printer and stuff like that. So this one comes across well. And to show you the interior art and modern copyright, please recycle. So here we come to book number 40, Mystery of the Desert Giant. This one is also important, not because of the text issue, but to my understanding, this was the last book to have a hardcover Tweed with dust jacket. So those original Tweed hardcovers with dust jackets only go up to this book, which is number 40. So from this point forward, it's all picture covers and then the later plastic covers. So if you like the hard covers with dust jackets, it's only going through this book, which is number 40. This particular copy, it's a little worn, so you can see the color's kind of faded and the spine's a little messed up. But again, you pick these up used over the years growing up, and condition is really going to vary. The plastic cover is done really well. The color depth is really maintained. So again, this is one that they did a really good job on. again, it does seem like there's some variation. And usually it's the earlier plastic covers from the 90s that seem to be printed better versus the copies from the 2000s, which can kind of look more like a washed out Xeroxed cover or copy, I should say. But anyway, same text, of course, because no text issues here. This one actually lists to Desert Giant, but it's generally thought that the hardcover with Dust Jacket was available for about a year or so. So this is probably from about 62 when they transitioned over to the picture covers. So this book came out in 61. So this is probably from 61, 62, somewhere in there when they were transitioning over to exclusively being picture covers. The interior has the brown and white endpapers, and I think I also picked this up probably at the same antique store because, of course, it has the same due date card glued in there. There's the interior art and copyright. Here on the revised text, of course, you have no endpapers, but blank ones. Here's the revised art. Well, I shouldn't say revised. Slip of the tongue. There is no revised. And, of course, modern copyright page. Another thing I should note is, of course, on all the plastic cover copies, you have a much whiter paper, actually. So it's very bright, very clear. But it is, you do kind of have to get used to that if you're jumping back and forth between vintage copies and then the modern plastic cover copies. So here are my two editions of The Clue of the Screeching Owl, which is, of course, revised text only since we're at book 41. Here I have an original picture cover copy. This dates to about 1965 because it lists to the Haunted Fort, but you do get the lovely cover art. As you can see, the difference that comes across in an original picture cover copy versus the plastic cover. Although the plastic cover still, generally they still look very, very good. But you can tell the difference as the original is not nearly as cropped, and it comes across a lot better to the naked eye, and especially when you hold them in your hands, and it doesn't have the glossy finish that's on all the plastic cover copies. But of course, the books themselves are identical inside. Of course, the spine difference. To show you, this of course has the black and white multi-scene endpapers, as it is a 1960s copy. And here's the interior art. And, of course, the copyright page, but it doesn't really matter as much with all the books from Chinese junk onwards. Now, for Viking Symbol Mystery, I only have the plastic cover version. A number of the later books, I just have the plastic cover version. I'm always trying to find a really nice, minty, earlier picture cover copy. But, usually what turns up in used shops and on eBay and such, they're usually dinged up. And so I always try and hold out for like a really good condition one before I get an upgrade or earlier copy. So, the plastic covers still hold up really well. I do really like the art for this. I generally like all the art for every volume. But this one in particular, I think, still holds up really well. And to show you the interior. So again, this same book and same text and everything, but of course printed on the whiter, much brighter, actually, paper stock of all of the plastic cover copies. And of course, the modern copyright page with the Please Recycle printing. Here are my copies of Mystery of the Aztec Warrior. This is an original 1964 copy because, again, the book list stops at this particular book. And that's, again, the best indication for if you have a first printing of a particular volume, if the book list stops there. Particularly, it's very easy on all of the books without revised text. But what's really interesting, this is one of the biggest variations I've seen personally. This is a first early printing of the book, and then this is a much later printing from about 1973 or so, because it lists to Shattered Helmet. But as you can see, the cover has been printed so darkly that the whole visual tone and style has been drastically altered. It's not just that the cover is darker, but the tone of the boys' shirts has changed, the way the map comes across, the little section of hand-drawn map there, even the sort of ghost-like appearance of an Aztec warrior seems different. So it's one of those that the the printing being different has totally altered the look and feel of the cover. And I mean, I still quite like this weird alternate cover. I mean, it's not really an alternate cover; it's just a printing being different or coming out really dark. Just as I have some where they came out really bright. And as you can see, the plastic cover goes back to how it should be, as it is on the first version, where the background is sort of a dusky, kind of earth tone red, I guess, to suggest sort of a red mud, or the Southwest, or just a general feel like that. Whereas this one, it's just like almost pure black with like a little tiny bit of brown. So that's just an interesting little thing I've found, and I picked it up, I think, at a used bookshop for like $1 or $2, just because it looks so different. And as you can see, my first copy, it's got a little bit of wear, and it's got the spine, it's kind of bent, which does happen, unfortunately, on some vintage copies, whether through abuse, wear, or tear, or they just start to do this sort of classic slanted design because they've done this over time. But if you compare these spines, they're actually pretty much the same in terms of the blue, so I don't know why the cover on the 70s copy is so different. And of course, if you compare the text, the 70s copy uses something closer to the Helvetica font that they would use from the late 70s onward, and through the 1980s copies, but otherwise it's the same. And then just to show you side by side, the original and the plastic cover. So this plastic cover comes very close. Of course, it's a little cropped on the edges to fit the blue border, but again, this is one that's printed well and doesn't crop off anything important, so it holds up very well in terms of representing the original art. Now, to show you the interior illustration, and of course, has the black and white end papers. Here's the interior illustration and original copyright page. Here for the Haunted Fort, I have an original first printing picture cover from 1965, and then here is the plastic cover variant. I really love this cover. I know some fans are not really big on this particular book, but then again, I have a soft spot for virtually all of the original Canon books. As you can tell, the plastic cover holds up pretty well in terms of art, but because it's been put on the glossy plastic cover, the color tonality is a bit different. This is a lot darker in printing, maybe a tad harsh compared to the original. And of course, you have the cropping on the edges, but it still holds up well. It's not one of the ones where the cropping was not done very well. But this is one of those that the original painting is so good that I think it really helps to have it on the original picture cover printing. And this is a really nice minty copy. And again, the way you can tell this is probably a first printing is because, of course, the book list stops at the actual printing of the book itself. And it still has the older style font, which would also indicate that it's a 60s printing. But, again, otherwise, same text in both books, but you do have the black and white end papers here. And, of course, in the plastic covers, you don't get any end papers. Here's the interior illustration and copyright date. And, of course, the picture covers will start to the pages will sort of brown, not quite yellow, but you can definitely tell it's an older book. So you will get a slight difference reading one of these as compared to the nice, clean, tightly bound plastic cover copy that has the pages are just like this very pure white. So that is another thing. That's both a good thing of the plastic covers, that they're all brand new and clean and everything, but it's also something that might not be somebody else's preference. Some people may have preference to the older style cardstock, so that's just down to a matter of preference, really. Here's my only copy of Mystery of the Spiral Bridge. This is a picture cover copy with this beautiful cover. Again, you don't get the cropping you would on the plastic cover copy. It is printed a little bit dark, but this is not a first printing, so I don't have one to compare it to side by side. Of course, you can tell it's a later printing because the number has been added here on the side. You'll also note the spine is more of a dark blue, and the typeface of the title, author, and publisher, and of course number is different. Then you get to the back, And this has the more modernized later 70s rear jacket with the redone Hardy Boys logo at the top, and then all the titles in Helvetica. This lists to the Wishmaster's key, which puts it at probably about a 1976 printing, if I had to guess, because that's, of course, when that book came out. This still has the black and white end papers. They kept these until about 1979, 1980, when they switched to the Cameo style of where Frank and Joe have these weirdly cartoonish looking faces poking out of these little window or doorways or something. So those are the last printings of the picture covers before they switched to the plastic. So here's the interior illustration and copyright page. So here is the secret agent on Flight 101, which is one of the stories that a lot of hardcore fans are not big on, but for me personally, it was one of the first books I got after Cabin Island, because the notion of the Hardys being involved with espionage and the book having elements that totally felt like they were trying to have a miniature James Bond adventure in a Hardy Boys context, that immediately sparked my childhood brain, and I had to have this. So it's still one of my absolute all-time favorites, and one of the ones I've read more than most because I had it very early on. As you can tell, this is my plastic cover copy, and the edges are the first things that start to get worn down on these. The blue kind of wears off when you read them a lot, and then the corners always start to get bumped or kind of curled in on themselves. So that's how you can tell a plastic copy has been well loved. This is an original printing from 1967, lists to Flight 101 on the book list, and of course doesn't have the number printed on the cover. It's in really great shape, so I was very happy to pick this up, of one of my favorites. As you can tell, the plastic cover is a bit contrastier, looks sort of, I mean, not quite washed out, but it's definitely a lot lighter. The original has a lot more color depth and is a lot richer overall. But this still holds up well, and if you didn't have this to put it next to, you wouldn't notice any of that. But you also notice like the color of the sky is a bit different, and the actual yellow of the title is a bit lighter. Cropping wise, it does okay, but it looks much better when you don't have the bright, vivid blue on the sides, which kind of distracts from the front cover image. Of course, here's the rear, where the listing stops at 101. Have the black and white end papers. And here is the interior illustration. I always thought it was interesting that this one is kind of squared off like a like the interiors used to be on the cover pages of the books from the 40s and 50s. Eventually, they transitioned to doing the full page, but this is an actual painting that's still squared off. So that was just something weird I always thought was interesting. And then there's the copyright page. Here's my copies of Mystery of the Whale Tattoo. This is a slightly later copy from the 70s. Again, you have the number in yellow, and it lists to Witchmaster's Key, which would probably put this at about 1976. This is the plastic cover copy. Again, same text, as there are no revisions past book 38. But you can tell the cover is a little bit different here. Of course, this is not cropped as this one is, but this printing is a bit darker, and the color comes across as a little bit different. But again, if you're not looking at copies side by side, you're not going to notice little things like that in terms of printing differences. So, of course, this has the darker blue and the more bold font, and the rear is this design, as this is a copy from the late 70s. Still has the black and white end papers, though. And here is the interior illustration. Here are my copies of the Arctic Patrol Mystery. And you'll note here the cover differences are kind of interesting. The original, this is probably a first printing because it stops at Arctic Patrol Mystery on the listing. So I'd say this was probably an original 1969 picture cover. This has more of a pinkish tint to it, whereas the plastic cover is more of sort of a greenish look. And again, the plastic cover in direct comparison, seems a bit contrastier, and the color is definitely very different in terms of bias. Again, I really love this painting. But, if you don't get to look at the actual painting, you don't know what the actual color should be like. And once you put these side by side, you start to notice differences in the printing. But again, if you didn't have them side by side, you just have no idea and move on. But anyway, so again, this should be a first printing. There's no number on the front. And then the rear is the 60s design and stops at Arctic Patrol Mystery. Show you the interior illustration. Of course, you have the black and white end papers. I can actually get there. What's interesting about this book is it actually gives you a map of Iceland across the pages here. So you don't have the normal front illustration as such, which I always thought was a really cool touch, especially reading this as a kid. It's not like I knew a whole lot about the geography of Iceland, so this really helped in reading the story and trying to orient one's mind around all of the Icelandic names. And of course, it really helped to fulfill the idea that the Hardys were going, all over the world as globe-trotting teens loose. So again, you don't have the normal front illustration. Then the plastic cover, I believe, also replicates that front. Yeah, there we go. So you get the map as well. And again, you can see that the actual paper stock is, of course, that very bright white that, again, may be off-putting to some people, but that is something you can get out of the reprints. Again, no front illustration. There's the copyright. So for Bombay Boomerang, I only have the plastic cover copy. I've always loved this book. I love the cover. This was the type of design that's on a lot of the later books where there'll be a central image item or items from the story. It's usually drawn to a huge sort of abstract scale, then a very bold background color, and then the boys will be somewhere, usually in a headshot or a duo shot like here. Again, not necessarily what everybody's going to like, but I always thought it was an interesting design. Nappy's covers for some of the Nancy Drew volumes around this time period also have a similar stylistic design to them, and I think they're very striking. But again, I'm sort of an apologist. I like pretty much all the covers and all of the books, so pretty much I'm good with anything. So yeah, I would love to get a nice picture cover version of this as well. So of course, blank end papers, since it is a plastic cover. Here is the interior illustration and modern copyright. Now for Danger on Vampire Trail, I have the opposite. I have this lovely minty condition original picture cover, and I don't have the plastic cover version. So here you can see, it looks a lot more vivid when there's no blue and no cropping, and it's very bold to hold this in your hand by having this really bold green background with a sort of swirly pattern, and then the vampire bats coming out of it, extraordinarily large, with the boys looking, very overwhelmed. So I really love this cover, and it looks really impressive this way. Hopefully I will get a good plastic cover copy to just, have both in the near future. But this is a really nice copy. It's not a first printing. It lists to Shattered Helmet here on the rear. So this is probably a copy from about 1973 or so. This book was published in 1971. So that's just my guess, but this is probably a second or third printing. So to show you the black and white end papers, of course, the interior illustration, and copyright. For the Masked Monkey, I only have the plastic cover, and this is one I would love to get a minty picture cover of. This is one of my favorite covers of the series. It's just really bold and really sets up that this is one of the stories that is very action-oriented, and the globetrotting aspect is there, and it just has such a sense of drama to it. I've just always loved this. And of course, again, you have the idea of a very giant version of something that happens in the story at some point, and just a very bold, vivid cover. and then of course the bottom is kept just a blank white, which makes it seem like they're in some otherworldly jungle where there are giant monkey heads that pop out of the ground and scream. So, anyway, this is the plastic cover version, and of course that means it has the blank end papers. Here is the interior illustration. Modern copyright. Same scenario for the Shattered Helmet. I only have the plastic cover version. Again, the art is in the sort of final wave style, I guess you could say, of the boys being confronted with a ginormous version of something from the story. Again, very bold background color. And again, I think all of the late period covers are absolute winners, but not necessarily going to be for everybody. So, to show you the interior illustration. And the modern copyright. For Clue of the Hissing Serpent, I have 2 volumes, both original picture covers. Neither one is a first printing. As you can see, both have added the spine number, but I do believe these are probably second and third printings. This is probably from 1975, and then this is probably from 1976. And the reason you can tell, again, is by which books they list to. So this lists to the very next book, Mysterious Caravan, whereas this book goes up to the Wishmaster's Key. You can also see by this point they transitioned over to the late 70s style of rear jacket. And this book is in obviously better shape, but it's also noticeably thicker. As you can see, the back cover actually comes above where the and rests above where the back of the older version is already slimmer. So again, that's something cool to note. By this point, they had already switched over to this, and it seems sturdier, but it just doesn't have the more classic appeal of the older logo. But they had already switched over to the Helvetica font for the book list, and it's very bold. So I've never been a big fan of this because it seems to clash with the classic blue picture cover. So look at the actual books. Again, this is definitely a bit thicker. This printing is a bit darker, but this one has the colors much more bold, particularly the greens, the yellow of Joe's hair there, and their faces come across more. But again, that's probably just down to printing differences, plus this copy is in a lot better shape. It's practically mint, whereas this was my older copy and it's obviously had more wear and tear over the years. So here you have black and white end papers. Here's the interior illustration and copyright page. So for Mysterious Caravan, I have this picture cover, which lists to the next book. So this is probably a second printing from 1976, as this is a 1975 book. And then here is the plastic cover version. Now, the cover actually comes across very well. The plastic cover is a tiny bit brighter and, of course, has a glossy sheen to it, in addition to the cropping on the edges. So the originals will always have that over the reprints because they have the full width and dimensions of the cover devoted to it. And the printing is usually a bit more solid, whereas these can vary, and it depends on how well they were copied when they were printed. And of course, you lose what was then the modern new Hardy Boys banner in the box form with the title number on the actually printed on here. And this is probably what gave them the idea to add the yellow numbers to the covers of all the other books when they were reprinted over and over. So you lose that on here because they've just pretty much cropped it out. But it's one of those that reprints very well. I think it's a very bold image, but again, very bright, vivid, bold background color with a good amount of empty space. So I know some people aren't fans of the late art, but I really enjoy it. So here, of course, you still have the black and white end papers. Here's the interior illustration and copyright. And of course, by this time they'd switched over to the modern rear cover as well, and the thicker binding and darker blue of the actual picture cover. So here we have the Witchmaster's Key, for which I only have the plastic cover. Would love to get a minty picture cover of this. I love this cover. This is one of the really interesting, really great late volumes. So to show you the interior illustration and modern copyright. Same goes for the Jungle Pyramid. I only have the plastic cover. Would love to get a minty picture cover. And in my opinion, and I know a lot of others share this opinion, this is probably the best of the late period books. This is a really great entry in this series, particularly even in the Canon books. But of the last 10 or 15 or so books, this is probably the best one. Has one of the best mystery plots of the whole series. Show you the interior. And modern copyright. So here's the Firebird rocket. I only have the plastic cover, and I really love the cover on this one. It's very bold. Again, you have this time a giant rocket, and the country of Australia as well behind the boys, and a nice vivid background too. So it's a nice, dramatically interesting visual cover. Here's the interior illustration, followed by the modern copyright. And here we have Volume 58, The Sting of the Scorpion, which is the final book in the original Canon series before the Grosset Dunlap lost the rights in a court battle to Simon & Schuster. So Grosset Dunlap from this point onward could merely reprint the first 58 volumes over and over and over again. And so that's what they did. And then Simon & Schuster started what came to be known as the Digest series with Volume 59. And the first number of those books were still supervised by the same staff, basically, of writers and everybody. So they do really pick up where this leaves off. But what's most interesting about this is a first printing, and this is the plastic cover. Of course, the color is a little bit different, and of course, the cropping on this changes the centering of the image, whereas here it's kind of more angled like this, has a lot more space around it. But what's most interesting about this is one of the very early first printings that still mentions the next upcoming book, which happened to be Night of the Werewolf, which was supposed to be book 59 of the canon, but once that court battle happened, that never came to pass, and then that was removed from all reprintings. So I remember reading a copy of this in the library when I was growing up, and remember that it mentioned Night of the Werewolf, and I thought I was just going crazy until years later I found that early copies did actually mention that, and then I finally found one in my usual bookshop scouring that actually had the first printing end page. So I'll go ahead and show you that if I can find it really quick. So here on page 179, you can see clearly at the bottom, and the italicized way they would put the title of the next book at the end of each book to advertise it. You can see indeed there that book 59 was to have been Night of the Werewolf and published as the next in the picture cover Canon format, but that never came to pass. So this, of course, has the same black and white end papers and interior illustration copyright page. So, of course, this book does not mention Night of the Werewolf since it's the reprint. Let me see what it actually says. Yeah, they just removed mention of anything. They pretty much just cut that whole sentence out on all of the reprints. So that's a fun alternate. So, of course, you think we might be done, but of course we have to talk about the Detective Handbook, which was originally published in the 1950s, and it's not necessarily a Hardy Boys book. It has some short story material, but it's all about police detecting methods and has a bunch of short stories about and then informational chapters about basically it's like a book for kids about police procedural. So it's an interesting idea. I always liked the concept, but of course, they just like the original textbooks they revised, they did do a revised edition and changed the collaborating author credits and such, and updated things to the 60s and 70s. So this was the third of 3 covers they did, and then they published it as part of the plastic cover form, which is what I have here. I do really like this, and I do plan on getting the other editions as well. Also really cool, they kept the original spine. So this is the one plastic cover book that actually has the original type spine with the classic red circle logo. And they even credit Grosset Dunlap down here. So that was just really interesting. I always wondered why they did this for this one particular book and then not any of the others, because I think it would have looked a lot better had they kept at least this and kept the iconography. Then the rear literally is a reprint of the 1970s design. So you have the 70s Hardy Boys logo and then the Helvetica printing of all of the titles up to Sting of the Scorpion. So this is a weird book, actually. It's a plastic cover book, but the jacket is a literal direct copy, front, back, and spine of the 1970s book. So it's kind of interesting in that way. Now to show you the interior, because it's not a typical book. Everything else is the same in terms of title page, layout, text block, everything, but it is not an actual Hardy Boys story. But yeah, it's a really interesting book if you've never read it. But of course, again, this was designed to really just teach kids about how the police work and then encourage them to be detectives themselves and then go around and dust the house for fingerprints and annoy everybody by having talcum powder everywhere. Lastly, I did want to mention these, which are a particular one-off that not everybody is necessarily familiar with. So as you can tell, these are all a different cover design, but are printed in the plastic cover form. These are actually the first couple of digest books, and these were printed in 2005 along with the first couple of Nancy Drew digests. And apparently what happened was that there was some sort of deal made that allowed Grosset and Dunlap to start republishing the digest books in the Canon plastic cover form. Unfortunately, this was a very short-lived series, wasn't really publicized. I found them by accident. I walked into our, I believe it was our local Books A Million when I was... and I always glanced at the Hardy Boys section just because by that point I had gotten, the original Canon revised text, which is all any new bookstore sold. And then I noticed a bunch of new ones with a thicker binding in terms of the spine, and they just looked different. And then it dawned on me these were actually original digests, and unfortunately they stopped at book 66. And now these, since they only had one print run, are very hard to come by, and a lot of collectors are trying to buy these and the Nancy Drew ones now. So generally these will go for quite a bit more than your usual plastic cover copy now because they're a one-off and quite rare. Some do use the original text of the original print runs of certain digests because a lot of the digests were reprinted several times and they would update the cover to the modern format they were using. So certain digests have like 3 or 4 different cover art variations sometimes. And then sometimes they have a little bit of text difference. Like for example, Night of the Werewolf in the original printing has a slightly different text that was later edited. And I know this one goes back to that first text for some reason. And what's also interesting is they kept the interior illustrations of these. So it's literally reprinted, so that means the text is not like the Canon books, it's like the digests. But you have the original front illustration, and the digest illustrations were done in this sort of full-page pencil sketch type design, so they're different than the more like ink lines of the Canon books. But so they kept all of the iconography of the digest, the way the contents page is laid out with the italicized chapter titles, and then they also kept the interior illustrations, which if I can find some of those. So as you can see here, this is literally the original text copied over. And since some of the digests, get more and more difficult to find, this was a really nice touch. It also helps that the first printing of digest only used a fraction of the cover art, so these give you a lot more, even though they still feel very cropped, and then the titles are just slapped on in yellow at the top with a credit to Franklin W. Dixon. So again, it could be better, but it was a really cool thing for them to do, and it's just unfortunate that they stopped. So again, nowadays these are very hard to come by. So if you happen to spot them, definitely pick it up if it's cheap and check it out. Compare it to your own digest copy if you have that particular volume. And again, I'll say these spines, you'll notice they're quite a bit thicker. Again, these were printed in 2005, so by this point, they had definitely, improved or changed around their plastic binding process. So it's just a fun alternate that I wanted to also mention because it doesn't really get talked about all that much. And while these are not viewed as books of the canon because they were published in the Digest series, they still technically kind of are because they would have been canon books. It just was because of that court case that they didn't get the rights to do that, and that's why they started this series at book 59. So pretty much from this book up until I believe it's Roaring River Mystery, which is I think about book number 80. So for about the first 20 or so books, it's still the same writing team as the last 15 to 20 books in the canon. So the first 20 or so digests are still, they're like quasi-canon. They should still technically be considered part of the original canon books, but they aren't because they're in the digest series. And that's kind of common because certain stories that were either used or not used would get recycled later on, like certain case files got recycled as digests once the case file series ended, and vice versa. Certain digests that were not used got revamped as case files. So they kind of pass that around sometimes. So I just wanted to end on this since this is technically the last print run of anything of the plastic cover series, so that further links them to the official canon. And with that, I want to thank everybody for watching through this. And if you've made it through this far, hopefully me babbling on about Hardy Boys editions has been informative or fun in some way or inspired you to further your own collections. So with that, thanks for watching, everybody.